Hello, welcome to our St. Paul Learn with the League. This month's program is a third in a series about equity and accessibility in voting. This month, we will learn about the barriers to the polls for voters aged 18 to 29. If you are interested, you can watch past programs on the League of Women Voters St. Paul YouTube. I'm Heidi Klumpkin, co-president of the League of Women Voters St. Paul. For over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked as a citizens league to improve our government and engage all citizens in the decisions that impact their lives. We join the efforts of 800 state and local leagues to bring nonpartisan political advocacy, education, and empowerment to the local level. Check out our website to learn more about membership in the League of Women Voters. Tonight, our program is supported with the League of Women Voters Roseville area and the League of Women Voters White Bear Lake area. Welcome to our neighbors. We are also supported by the Suburban Community Channels and St. Paul Neighborhood Network. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are learning today on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota, Minnesota. And this is the current homeland of many Native nations, including many Dakota and Ojibwe. The program tonight is being recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live. Towards the end of the program, our panelists will take questions from the audience. Please use the Zoom Q&A bubble at the bottom of the screen. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please put your questions in the comment section. Also, we are using the Zoom closed caption feature. They are auto-generated, so they might not be exact. With 1 week to Election Day, I hope everyone has a voting plan or has already voted. I know many of you are watching have local elections and can find more information through your local league and county elections office. Moving on to our program tonight, after elections, we love to break down voter turnout and other information about voters. We often hear that the youngest voters, ages 18 to 29, have the lowest voter turnout. We wanted to learn more about the barriers they face to voting. So we are pleased and lucky to have a few panelists with us tonight. As always, we are excited to learn from them as they share information and their experiences. We are so happy that they are willing to share the barriers they've encountered. Keep in mind that the barriers they share might not have been barriers for you at this age. However, they are very real to our panelists. First, we will hear from Professor Paul Goren of the University of Minnesota, and I'm going to do a little introduction of all of our panelists before we get started. Paul Goren is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on American politics, public opinion, political psychology, applied statistics, and econometrics. He's the author of the book on voter competence and multiple research articles in leading professional journals in the field. His current research centers on the relationship between basic human values, public opinion, and symbolic ideology, how opinion on moral issues shape partisan and religious predispositions over time, and how welfare opinions reinforce racial prejudice. His research on welfare and race is funded by the Russell Sage Foundation. Also with us tonight are voters who are in the 18 to 29 age range. We will hear from Jordan Hartman, student at the University of Minnesota, and Grace Reardon recently graduated from Macalester College. We look forward to hearing about your experiences. So tonight, we're going to start with Professor Goren. I'd love to hear you have a presentation for us, and then we'll take questions at the end. So if you wanted to have questions for Professor Goren, feel free to put those in the chat.
Thank you, Heidi. Let me share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see this.
Yes, looks great.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you also to the League of Women Voters, St. Paul, and sister chapters for sponsoring this webinar and for graciously inviting me to participate. And thanks to everyone who turned out tonight. See what I did there. Let me begin, if I may, by showing you what appears on the homepage of my undergraduate class on public opinion. There's the course title, the course description, but I'd like to draw your picture to the image I use on the homepage of the class. It shows 4 young people, approximately in their early to mid-20s, turning out to do their civic duty on election day. It's a nice image, but as we know, it's probably not accurate in representing which voters typically turn out on election day. I'd like to begin with some graphs and data, because that's what professors do, provide some context for tonight's discussion. So this first graphic is using census data to show voter turnout in presidential election years from the 2000 to the 2020 election. Those are the blue bars. And then over here on the right-hand side of the diagram are red bars that show registration rates for voting age adults 18 and older. And the point I want to stress here is that in most recent presidential elections from 2000 up to 2016, voter turnout hovered anywhere from about just above 59% to just below 64%. In the 2020 election, turnout increased to almost 67%. 2020 turnout, again at 66.8%, is the highest turnout since the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in 1920. The 2020 election was extraordinary in a number of respects, including record-setting turnout in the modern era. But as we all know, turnout varies by age year over year over year. So in this graphic, what we have here is turnout levels for different age groups in the 2000, 2004, 2012, 2016, 2020 presidential election. The overall turnout figure is this middle line here, the dark line. And what I want to draw your attention to is the contrast between our youngest voters, 18 to 29, our Generation Z, Gen Z voters, and this line up here on the top, our senior voters who are 65 years or older. And we can see that among the youngest voters, every presidential election from 2000 to 2020, younger voters, our youngest voters, Gen Z, has turned out at the lowest rate, anywhere from about 37% in 2000 to 53% in the 2020 election. This top line here for our senior citizen voters, age 65 and above, they have always turned out near or at the highest level. So in 2020, 2000 or 2020, again, Gen Z voters in 2020 turned out at a 53% rate. Voters 65 years and older turned out at a 78% rate. Some more data, if you will. Here is some census data that shows 2020 turnout statistics by age group. And what I want to emphasize here are a couple of things. I'm going to contrast our 18 to 24-year-old group and our 65 plus group to show you the shares of the population that each age group makes up, and then the share of the voting population, the people who actually turned out. And what we'll see is that people 65 and older are overrepresented in the population of people who turned out. People 18 to 24 are underrepresented. So what I mean is this. In 2020, there were approximately 26,737,000 voting age adults age 18 to 24. 18 to 24-year-olds made up 12% of the voting eligible population. They voted at about a 51.4% rate. And so among the population of voting eligible adults, 18 to 24-year-olds represent 12%, but among the people who actually turned out, 18 to 24-year-olds represent only 9% of the turnout population. In other words, 18 to 24-year-olds were underrepresented in the turnout population by 23%. Now, if we jump down here to this bottom row, the bright red bold-faced numbers, people age 65 and older make up about 53,236,000 plus voters, or voting eligible adults. That's about 23% of the population. 65-year and older adults voted at a 74.5% rate. And so they represented about 26% of the voting age population. In other words, the 65 plus group was overrepresented in the voting population by 12%. So again, the summary here, 18 to 24-year-olds make up 12% of the population, but only 9% of actual voters. 65 plus voters represent 23% of the population, but 26% of the turnout population. You can put it like this. Seniors outnumber the youngest voters by about a 2-to-1 margin in the US population of voting age adults. But seniors outnumber the youngest voters by a 3-to-1 margin in the actual population of people who turned out. A couple more comparisons I'd like to draw your attention to, and then start to kind of unpack what are some of the barriers that our youngest voters face. So with some new data that has just come out this past July, it's possible to look at the turnout probability on a scale from 0 to 1. 0, you're definitely not turning out to vote. 1, you definitely turned out. We can see how these turnout probabilities vary for people in different age groups. So in Generation Z, our 18 to 29-year-olds, the predicted probability that a Gen Xer would turn out is about 0.56, 0.57. Among our boomer generation, people aged 56 to 74, turnout probability was predicted to be about 0.75. So what this means is that boomers were about 15 points more likely to turn out in the 2020 election than Generation Z voters. And what's important about this particular graphic, these data, is that they take into account things like the fact that Generation Z voters have lower income, and they're not married, and they've lived in their current place of residence for a much shorter time than baby boomers. So when we take all that into account, we see boomers again are about 15 points more likely to turn out in 2020. If we do the same exact comparison, turnout probability here for Generation Z voters, 18 to 29, and the silent generation, members of the silent generation, that is people age 75 and older, were about 27 points more likely to turn out than Generation Z voters. So baby boomers, about a 15-point advantage in turnout on election day 2020. Silent generation, about a 27-point turnout advantage. All right, so what have we seen so far? The data confirm, they show pretty conclusively that young voters turn out at lower rates than middle-aged voters. Middle-aged voters also turn out at lower rates than seniors do, than older voters. We've seen that younger voters are underrepresented in the electorate. 18 to 24-year-olds make up 12% of the US voting eligible population, but only 9% of the turnout population. Senior citizens are overrepresented in the turnout population. Our senior citizens, people 65 and older, make up 23% of the voting eligible population and 26% of the turnout population. So the question is why? What factors affect turnout? And how are those factors related to age? So there's been a lot of research on this carried out by political scientists and sociologists especially. And we know that economic and social factors, background factors, socio-demographic characteristics affect the probability someone will turn out. In other words, college graduates turn out at higher levels than non-college graduates. Married people turn out more than single people. People with higher incomes turn out more than people with lower incomes. But it turns out when you examine these data closely, these economic and social factors have only a limited impact on turnout. The real forces that seem to drive turnout, at least at the individual level, are what political psychologists refer to as psychological factors, psychological predispositions. So here are 3 that are really important for predicting why someone will turn out on election day. Partisanship is one factor. We think of the Democratic Party, Republican Party, the attachments people have to those parties vary in terms of their strength and intensity. Some people are strongly attached to their party, dare I say extremists. And those strong partisans, those extreme partisans, are much more likely to turn out than people who have a sort of casual or passing attachment to their party and independence. In other words, the more strongly someone identifies with the political party, the more likely they are to turn out and cast a ballot on election day. Political interest is the single most important factor, single most important psychological factor that predicts whether or not someone will turn out on election day. Some people follow politics all the time. They're on their iPhones, they're on the web, scrolling for news, doom scrolling in the kind of the current era that we live in. Other people pay attention to politics periodically, once every 4 years, let's say. Other people pay absolutely no attention to politics. They spend a lot of time on the internet looking up hockey blogs and cat videos, but never looking up anything on politics. The more politically interested people are, the more likely they are to turn out on election day. The less interest people have in politics, the less likely they are to turn out on election day. So stop the presses, right? This is not sort of an earth-shattering revelation. But it is important to note that of all the factors that shape turnout propensities, political interest is by far the strongest predictor. So that's why I'm stressing it here. Finally, people vary widely in terms of whether they see voting as a duty or as an obligation. I don't want to do this. I don't want to go out and vote on election day. It's a hassle. I'm busy, but I have to because that's my obligation as an American citizen. It's my right as an American citizen to vote, and I'm going to exercise that vote, even if it's an inconvenience to me. Some people have that kind of mentality. They view voting as a duty. Others see voting as more discretionary, as a choice. Maybe I'll vote, maybe I won't vote. It kind of depends on what's going on. Depends on how many cute cat videos I've got in my feed. And so again, people vary widely in terms of whether they see voting as a duty or voting as a choice. And the more you see voting as a duty, the more likely you are to turn out on election day and cast that ballot. So probably obvious where I'm going with this. Where do young people fall on these three dimensions: partisan strength, political interest, and duty versus choice? So if we look at this graphic here, what we have here is Generation Z has a weaker partisan attachment than boomers. So again, the strength of one's party ID predicts whether or not you're going to turn out on election day. We've got strong partisans, weak partisans, leaning partisans, and people who have no attachment to the party, independents. And among Generation Z individuals, 18 to 29, they tend to be sort of slightly weak partisans. Among our baby boomers, again, they tend to be a little bit more partisan. So that's about an 8-point difference. In other words, boomers on average score about 8% stronger on partisan strength than our Generation Z respondents. Not a huge difference, but when added to the other differences, it adds up. On this figure, we see political interest ranging from people who have no interest at all to those who have some, those who have a lot. And again, the key point to take away is that among our Generation Z respondents, people age 18 to 29, on average, they manifest or they say they have some interest in politics. Among baby boomers, they have quite a bit of interest in politics. So this difference works out to approximately 25%. In other words, baby boomers score on average 25% higher on political interest than Generation Z voters. And again, that's important because political interest is a major predictor of turnout on election day. And finally, I also talked about whether people view voting as a choice, as a duty, or something in between. And again, boomers tend to be more inclined to see voting as falling closer to the duty end of the scale, whereas our Generation Z respondents are more inclined to see voting as not quite as much of a duty. That's about a 10% difference. And so the bottom line is that Generation Z respondents are less attached to the parties. They haven't been following politics that long. If you're 26 years old, you've maybe voted in one election, if that. If you're 56 years old or 76 years old, you've voted in many more elections. And so Generation Z respondents, just less attached to the party. Their partisan identities are less fully formed. They're weaker than the partisan identities of middle and older voters, and that influences turnout. Generation Z individuals are less interested in politics than middle-aged, their middle-aged and older counterparts. And again, this is partly a function of time. A 24-year-old has not had nearly as much time as a 44 or 64 or 74-year-old to follow politics, to see how politics intrudes on their lives. Less interest in politics among Generation Z voters translates into lower turnout. And Generation Z respondents, again, are less inclined to see voting as a duty, more inclined to see voting as a choice, as optional, relative to middle-aged and older people. So for Generation Z, those of you who are 18 to 29, you're less attached to parties, you're less interested in politics, you're less inclined to view voting as an obligation, as a duty. That will change as you move through the life cycle, as you move into your 30s and 40s and 50s and beyond. Those partisan attachments will grow stronger, your interest in politics will rise, and your inclination to see voting as more of a duty, less as a choice, that should go strong, that should grow stronger as well. All of which is to say that there are significant psychological barriers, significant psychological factors that tend to depress turnout. And those psychological factors tend to be concentrated most heavily in our youngest voters. They're hard to overcome. It's hard to overcome these barriers, right? We go back to one of the figures I showed earlier, and you can see between 2000 and 2020, turnout increased for 18 to 29-year-olds from 37% up to 53%. That's great news, but it increased for all the other voting age blocks as well. And so the bottom line is, the last thing I'll say is, what might we do? What might we consider? What force might overcome the kind of psychological resistance that is concentrated among our younger voters? And the simplest answer I can come up with, and also the most controversial answer, is this: let's make voting mandatory. If voting is mandatory, then people are compelled to turn out, they're forced to turn out, or pay some, suffer some minor penalty. If you made voting mandatory, I guarantee that these gaps we see between our Gen Z voters and our baby boomers would shrink considerably. After the past year, where we've dealt with difficulties, we've seen difficulties with mask mandates, vaccine mandates, it's hard to imagine that this is a realistic solution, that is a mandate that everyone is required to turn out to vote. But with that said, again, I think the mandate would be the way to go. It's controversial, but if you want to increase youth turnout and turnout across the board, that is the way to do it. I'll stop there, and now I will pass it on to Jordan Hartman. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, I love looking at all that data and that information. I love that you were able to break that down for us. Thank you. Yeah, let's hear from Jordan and the story that you are going to share with us about your voting experience. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your voting experience and barriers you've encountered, maybe what turned you off of voting for a while?
Yeah, so I guess, to be fair, I have voted, and my voting history is sparse. I would say I voted in one election, this past presidential election. And I would say, like, in the past and like currently, what's kind of like turned me off, I guess you could say, to voting is, well, when I was younger, I like just grew up in a house where it was like, that kind of put me, I would say, like, that put me in a position where I was like, okay, politics really isn't my thing. You know what I mean? And then it started as I got older, and as I did have more of my own time, my life just got busier. So I'm just someone that's like, if I don't have time to research the topic and get to know like everyone involved and like their points and stuff, I have a really hard time backing or like putting in support in someone I don't really know what they're about. So I could go with the flow, but I'm like, what if that's not the right choice for me? So I'm just someone that tends not to have, I feel like Professor Goren said, I feel like it's good to go after him. I'm like the epitome of his slideshow. Like, I just like, I'm not super attached to a party, so I need to like get a lot of research in, and I just don't have a lot of time with like school and work. So I guess that's kind of what has inhibited me so far. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Do you see maybe in the future it becoming a yearly habit if you live in a place where there's yearly elections?
Yeah, so I'm definitely I'm trying to get more into it, especially since like my girlfriend now, she's really into the whole voting thing, and she's like, it's what you should do. So I have like a little bit more of a push to go, and I think if I like started and got in the habit of like researching and all that stuff and like being like, okay, I would be more inclined to go, because I have that like extra push. So I know like I've got some local elections in Minneapolis right now coming around, and I'm pretty sure I'll be voting in those. So yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. Thank you. And I also want to reiterate, like, I remember my own voting experience when I was in this age group. Like, I remember voting in my first election when I was 18 because it was school board and there was a school referendum. and just coming out of that school, but I'm pretty sure I didn't vote the next year. So I hear
was
you.
like freshman year of college, and I was like just getting in the swing of things. And then
Yep.
it was the time to vote, and I was like, I don't know anything. So like I was just like, I'm gonna hands up, stay out of it type deal.
Yeah, from the start of the school year, it kind of sneaks up on you.
Yeah, it's like
All of a sudden
oh,
it's
God.
November.
Like I just took like you're like I'm in the middle of finals and now I have to go vote, and where do I vote? I'm in a completely different part of the state. Like yeah.
Yeah. Do you talk to your friends about voting? You mentioned your girlfriend is giving you information, but do you have talked about other people your age about voting and upcoming elections and such?
I would say, especially now since like most of my friends are renting and stuff, this rent stabilization one that was just going by, we talked a little bit more about, just since it like that obviously affects us more. I would say if it's something that affects us more, my friends talk about it a lot more, but like the overall general, I think there's way more voting that happens that I'm even aware of, and I think it's just because my friends aren't super into voting. But that could be it. I would say if it affects us, yeah, we'll talk about it, see what's up. But other than that, like we're not paying attention or something.
Yeah, that makes sense too.
Yeah.
Have you ever considered running for an office, whether it's through like school or through, I know you're in
Yeah.
between schools right now, but if
Yeah.
you're any of that?
Honestly, no, I'm not like a really good like leader type. I don't think that like any organization would be at its best if I was like at the lead. I'm more of like a tell me what to do and I'll help you person type deal. You know what I mean? So I would say probably not. Other people could do it way better than I could.
Well, maybe when you reach some of these other age groups that Paul mentioned, then
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Maybe I'm one of these people, like you said, I'm the epitome of the young vote. Maybe when I'm older, I'll be like, voting is necessary.
Exactly. Is there anything else you wanted to share about your experience before we move on to Grace?
No, other than just, I think maybe we should pay a little bit more attention now that I see like there's such a I was paying attention to Goran's and I was like, there's such like a drastic turnout that maybe if we're underrepresented that much, maybe we should show up a little more, since we always like, we're like, we don't like it, but we got to show up to do it. So
Well, later on, we'll ask what you would recommend, how we as league members and volunteers can help do that. So if you want to think on that, and then we'll reach back with that question at the end.
all right. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to learn from you. And I'd love to hear Grace's story.
Yeah, for sure.
Hi, Grace. I'm going to ask very similar questions that I asked Jordan as well. So could you tell us a little bit about your voting experience and the barriers you have encountered?
Yeah, so my name is Grace. I was always very, very into voting. I think I voted in all of the elections that I've been able to. And it's been just, I was a political science major in college. Like it's just been a part of my life. And when I moved recently to a new apartment, I jumped online and I re-registered to vote with my new address. And then I kind of didn't think about it. And in hindsight, I realized I never got my little voter card that you get in the mail. And I co-chair the youth vote committee for the League of Women Voters, St. Paul. And so I was working on getting together a training for our student leaders. And I was like, oh, let's check to make sure I'm registered to vote and my voter registration is good. And the website was like, we have questions. And I was like, that does not look right. So really only because of my work with the League of Women Voters, I knew to call the Ramsey County Elections Office. And they basically told me like, we never got an address verification, and your voter registration didn't go through. And the day before they'd actually resent out the card. So I was like, okay, I'll wait to see if that shows up. And basically their only solution for me, and I live in a weird building, the unit numbers are confusing and, mail does not always get to us correctly. So I knew that was the issue. And the only solution that they really had for me was to call my post office and to see if I could work it out with them. But I was like, okay, I'll just wait. I'll wait a few days to see if the card shows up. And the card did show up. So I didn't have to go through the whole steps of calling the post office and doing all of that. But it did make me think, like, if that had happened to almost anyone else I knew my age, like, I don't think they would have known to go through those steps, or had like the time or the energy, or like, you know, the care to do that. I mean, some people would, but and I would have showed up at the polls and they would have been like, we do not have your voter registration. And luckily in Minnesota, I could have just registered to vote in person day of, and then hopefully that card would have gotten to me and it would have worked out, but I really easily could have not. Yeah.
Yeah, were you frustrated for those few days in between this confusion and then waiting for that card?
Yeah, I was a little frustrated just because there was no other solutions. Like if it had kept happening and I wouldn't have been able to go to the post office or whatever, like there was just I couldn't prove residency any other way, is what they told me. So like that, and I know people have similar issues, other renters have similar issues, people on reservations have similar issues. So yeah, that's, it didn't end up being a barrier for me, but I can see really easily how it could end up being a barrier for other people.
Would you, my question is like, have you been turned off? Would you have been turned off of voting? I mean, it seems like it's worked out, but like, do you think that could have happened?
I think like, especially for these like smaller local elections, it could have. There's, not a ton on the St. Paul ballot this year, important things, but pretty short. And, so I think like, I think for bigger elections, I would have pushed a little bit, and, I can see myself pushing a little bit more, but yeah, I can see how it could have.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You've already mentioned that you have voted yearly and it's become a habit for you. Did you have a background in voting? Like, was it part of your a family ritual or something in school that helped support that?
My parents both vote, at least in like presidential elections, if not more than that. But I do think there's like, I grew up in like a culture of like political debate and like political discussion. And, then like coming to McAllister, that definitely like continued as sort of a value. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you talk about voting with your friends? I mean, being a political science major, I'm sure it was pretty easy, but other people who aren't political science majors, you talk about voting and the elections and upcoming issues?
Yeah, pretty frequently. I think it really like depends on who, and I think there is a lot of my age that I know, which obviously is like only certain section, there is a like distrust and like apathy towards elections and like thinking about how much impact that can have, that leads to a lot of apathy. So at least the people I know who like don't vote, I mean, sometimes it's just, I forgot there was an election, I forgot to change my address, whatever. But I think it's often not that people care about the issues that are happening or like know like the issues. It's like, what impact is my vote in this election going to have?
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you. And last question, have you ever considered running for office?
Very briefly, right during lockdown, I convinced myself, I was like alone and isolated. I was like, maybe I'll just move home. And I had a whole plan to become mayor of my tiny 1,000 person town, which I still think would have been successful, but I am much more interested in doing work behind the scenes. And do not think that I will run for public office.
Did you want to share a bit? I know that you've moved states. Was there ever any barriers in moving between the two states, or, absentee any of those and being registered and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I'm from Georgia. I voted, when I first moved to college, I decided to keep voting there, and I had to figure out absentee voting, which was just, it was kind of, I mean, it was kind of complicated. It was multi-step. I think I had to mail something in. And I think I had a lot of questions, and like my friends had a lot of questions about like, you know, whether or not it made sense to vote here or vote back home, and I think that like kind of indecision, that like not knowing caused a lot of people to just be like, yeah, I'm just not going to deal with it this year. And then, but like the process of like, so absentee voting was kind of a pain, but the processing of becoming registered to vote in Minnesota was much more simple. But Minnesota has easier voter registration, more accessible voter registration laws.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to share about your experience before we open it up to questions?
I don't think so.
Thank you. Well, opening up to questions for everyone. So if you have some questions, you can either enter them onto the chat box on Facebook Live, those will be communicated, or you can put them in the Q&A box and they'll be shared with us to ask. So Grace and Jordan and Paul, if you wanted to put your videos on so we can all see you. I'd love to hear, my first question is, if you haven't already answered this, which I think Grace and Jordan, you have, but Paul, if you're willing to share, like what made you interested in voting or even doing the research that you've been doing?
Well, I was trying to think back to my voting history, and I'm old enough that I really had to spend a lot of time going back pretty far. The first time I would have voted would have been 1988. That's just when I would have been of age. And I don't think I voted in that election. My home state was Rhode Island. I was going to college as undergrad in Pittsburgh. And so I think I may have, I'm ashamed to admit it, kind of sat out that election. But I guess that kind of makes the point, right? As you're younger and you're less settled. And then I voted in every presidential election since then. I voted for Republicans, independents, or third-party candidates, Democrats. I did not vote in 2004. At the time, I lived in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona. And I had a real bad day at work. And then my wife told me that she was went to vote. I don't remember how young or how many kids we even had back then, which she had at least 2 young kids, literally standing in line for 3 hours. I think the polls were closing in Phoenix, maybe 8 o'clock, and I might not have gotten out of the office until like 7 o'clock. So I sat that election out, and again, I'm not proud of it, but the access issues in Phoenix is not, at the time, was not a very friendly, not lots of polling outlets, polling booths, polling stations. And so it was harder to vote there than it is in Minnesota. And so sometimes these barriers, the lack of access can kind of get in the way. So that's my voting history, and it's just I've always been interested in politics. I've had followed for a long time, and then realized I can actually make a living actually studying things like why people turn out and why they don't turn out.
After hearing Grace and Jordan's stories, did you have any other data to share? It seems like they really, the information that you shared really echoes kind of their personal experiences as well.
Yeah, I'll just sort of comment on that. Jordan, I didn't mean to reduce your sort of voting history to my slides, but I thought the way you put that sort of really hammered home the point I was trying to make. There's a lot of data, a lot of charts, but sometimes a straightforward narrative works really well. And so that worked really well. And neither Jordan or I rehearsed this before the webinar tonight. And I thought Grace's example of how when she switched addresses was really telling. Even though Grace is part of Gen Z in that younger group, she was determined to figure out, how am I going to get re-registered to vote in my new location, my new address? And then when there was that snafu, she kind of really worked that. So that's a perfect example of how motivation really can sort of push some people through the barriers they might face. The last thing I'll say is the research I presented is not meant to be sort of judgmental. It's just young people have a lot going on in their lives. You're leaving home, you're taking classes, you're working, you're trying to figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life. Your parents are badgering about you. Do you have your life figured out yet? No, not usually. That's going on. Your sort of new relationships, platonic or romantic relationship, moving. So it's perfectly understandable why young people don't vote at rates that people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s do, because as you age, you answer a lot of those questions, you get more settled, and then you have more time to turn your attention to politics. But I just want to be clear, the research is not judgmental. It's just saying these are the reasons why, not, young people are not doing their civic duty. There's a lot of understandable reasons why voter turnout is depressed at younger ages.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do have a question in the chat for Jordan and Grace. So if Jordan, you wanted to answer this first after I read it, and then Grace, but do you know about the resources for researching candidates, and do you think your peers know about them and how to find ballot information and polling place and candidate stances and issues and stuff, or is that part of all the overwhelming information that can be hard to find?
I guess for me personally, and I would say like my friend group, my peers and stuff, I would say I probably don't, my friends probably don't. I don't, none of my classes or my work centers around like politics or any of that. So I guess like any like non-biased information that we could get, I feel like sometimes like, I don't know, it just seems like inaccessible or something. So I would say we might be a little clueless on where to get it, to be honest, because it's like, you got like the main sources, but they can be a little biased sometimes. So I would say,
yeah, I always feel like it's hard on local elections, really hard, because you don't hear it on the national news. Friends from out of town, either on all the social medias, aren't like sharing information and all that. So
I'm like,
yeah, it can be really hard to find.
Yeah, like I don't even know what I'm supposed to be looking up if I don't know the election's happening. So like, so I guess that's, yeah, I would say that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And also, like, I'm sure you don't like read a newspaper. I mean, I read the newspaper, so I know that they've got information on there too. But if you don't,
yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't really read the newspaper or anything, so yeah,
that's okay. I feel like I am like the only person getting the newspaper.
no.
Anyway, sorry. That's
newspaper.
a side note. Grace, did you want to share, like, do you and your friends and people your age that you know where to access this information? I mean, I know you do because you're a member of the League of Women Voters, but like other people.
I was going to echo what Jordan said and also kind of what you said. I think it's really hard to find information for local elections. And like where to even start is like not like, it's hard to even get there through like a couple Googles. You really have to dig. So I think particularly for local elections, I think everyone I know struggles with that, finding good information and not just being like, well, vote for the incumbent or whatever.
Well, thank you both so much. I have another question for Paul. It's about your mandatory voting stance. So do you have any idea how that works in Australia? Did people resist, or is it just kind of a given now? Is there kind of a trend setting there?
So a lot of European nations and nations in other part of the world, Australia, New Zealand are good examples. Voting is required, it's mandatory. And I don't have the data in front of me, but my recollection is turnout rates in countries with mandatory voting laws is north of 80%, sometimes considerably north of 80%. I suspect that there are pockets of resistance in some of these countries, in some of these states. They've made it work. They've made it work for a while. I think in the United States, if there was ever an effort to make voting mandatory, it would provoke a lot of resistance, a lot of backlash, and there would have to be a period of adjustment. And then eventually what happens is what's controversial at time one, or year one, the new law, new requirement, becomes less so with the passage of time. And maybe after 5 or 10 years, what was once controversial becomes a norm, and then it's acceptable. Most people will go along with it without a fight.
Thank you. This is a question for all of you. So many candidate events, such as candidate forums, whether it's by the League of Women Voters or community councils or school groups, they occur in the evening. Is this helpful or a barrier to our younger voters? Do you have evenings free and do you want to attend a candidate forum?
I guess I could go. I would say I work in the restaurant industry, so that is like key time for people when I need to be at work. So I would say that evenings, while for like the older people, like people who have like 9 to 5s, it's very handy. It's very helpful because, you know, they're off work. The majority of them are off work. But for younger people, typically we like go to school during the day, or we'll like you can go to work at night. Or like you have, if you don't go to school, maybe you work during the day. But I would say a lot of young people have something to do during the day and at night. So I would say that it gets a little hard when it comes to people that are younger.
Yeah, that makes so sense. I hadn't thought about that much, but yeah, I remember working in the evenings as well. Grace, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think young people just have a lot of competing responsibilities. And, you know, candidate forums can be an hour and a half, 2 hours, and it's hard to make time when you have work and school and family care responsibilities. So ways to adjust that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, did you want to address this?
What I'll say is this: there's often proposals that sound really good on paper, and some of these proposals get implemented to make it easier for people to get information and to vote. The classic example that always comes to my mind is the motor voter law that was passed in 1993 under former President Bill Clinton and his Democratic allies in Congress. And the idea here, of course, is that when you register to get your driver's license, you can also register to vote. At the time, there was a lot of hope that this reform would make it easier for everybody to vote, for non-voters in particular. But what actually happened is, after passage of the motor voter law, turnout rates didn't really go up. The only people who really took advantage of the registering to vote when they got their license, people who would have registered otherwise anyway. And so I think we have a lot of there's an inclination, a lot of hope. If we get the right reform, if we have a national voting holiday, for example, then turnout is going to sort of go up 10, 15 points. Maybe it does go up a couple of points, but I think a lot of people who are already interested in politics are going to vote whether or not it's a holiday. And people who just don't really care about politics because they're disinterested or not attached to a party, national voter holiday to them is holiday, and they might not use that time to vote. So candidate forms, provision of more information, making it easier to vote, these all sound really good in principle, but as a practical matter, they don't always work nearly as well as reformers would hope.
I think about that with the national voter holiday as well. Like, as Grace were saying, you know, if they work these jobs where it's at the not 9 to 5 hours, I mean, are they actually going to have to end up working in a service industry? These voters on a holiday like that, you know, how so many people do have to work extra on like 4th of July and Memorial Day and Labor Day. You know, it would actually be a holiday for people in those industries at that age group.
Just one other thing I'll add, you know, the voter holidays might, you know, again, stimulate turnout gains. Let's just pick a number, you know, 4%. So maybe somewhat disappointing, but all groups, age groups might go up, and it wouldn't necessarily be concentrated only among young voters. So that might be a good reform to increase turnout overall. But if the intent of the reform is to really enhance turnout among the lowest participatory groups right now, I'm less confident that it would deliver, the benefits would be targeted to those low voting groups, and just it might go up for everyone by the same amount.
Thank you. I have a question for Jordan and Grace. It sounds like you and your peers are interested in research that can be trusted and accessible, and it seems like sometimes that's hard to find. Do you have any recommendations for now, how you find how you and your peers might get trusted information?
Currently, right now, I would say that a lot of my peers personally just know that the information that we are given cannot always be trusted, but we do not necessarily have the time or maybe motivation to go out and find those things. So I think for me at least, and the people I know, I would say that we probably don't know where to get trusted information just because we haven't put like 100% of the time we could into it.
Thank you.
Heidi, I feel like you were just queuing me up to promo the, not promo, but I have started pointing people towards the League of Women Voters voting guide. I think it's helpful and good background information on candidates and issues. So that's where I'm going for this election.
I might actually use that.
Perfect. Yeah, I know Minneapolis has put out a voter guide for sure. And they also had a couple debates related to your ballot initiatives. So definitely, if you have some time to look those up. Yeah, the League of Women Voters often locally puts out a voter guide related to the elections. And this year, League of Women Voters St. Paul has published a voter guide in English, Spanish, and Hmong. So it's available in multiple languages as well. So we're excited about that. There are so many questions coming in. Professor Goren, since you've lived in so many states, do you have any comments on Minnesota laws and regulations regarding voting?
So I voted in, let me see if I can recount this. Pennsylvania, Illinois, Arizona, so 4 states. In my experience, Minnesota, or at least the Twin City areas and kind of surrounding suburbs where I've been since 2006, really make it easier to vote than any place I've lived before. So there sort of may be room for improvements at the margin, but it's been real easy in the 15 years or so since we've been here for us to vote. And I kind of knew that when I was moving here from Phoenix. You know, sociologists and political scientists have kind of, they look at states or regions by their political culture. And Minnesota has always had a reputation among scholars who study this is one where the public, the citizenry is committed to its civic duty and civic responsibilities. And the way I think that plays out in Minnesota, the most visible way it plays out is Minnesota is usually at the top or near the top or at the top in terms of voter turnout in elections. So it's been easy. It's been a pleasure to vote here. It's easier than any place I've ever lived. And again, it's the state and its citizens are kind of committed to making voting as easy as possible and taking it seriously as a responsibility and an obligation.
Thank you. This question is for all 3 of you. A few years ago, St. Paul voted on the trash issue, and we had some of the highest voter turnout in St. Paul for a non-statewide or a non-presidential election. And so I was wondering if you could speak for a little bit on issues that would resonate with you. I mean, I don't know the voter breakdown for the trash debate. If there was high voter turnout in your age group or not, but are there certain issues? I know you mentioned like the rent issue was something that you're interested in and talking about, but are there other issues that could possibly be on the ballot that would encourage you to vote?
This links to something that I wanted to say earlier. I think like it's really important to recognize that like just because young people don't necessarily have high voter turnout, they do engage civically in lots of other ways. Like we've seen massive youth like climate movements and like gun control movements. And I think like watching what youth are getting passionate about can really point to that answer. Because people like there's issues that are getting youth really like excited and motivated and fired up. So
yeah, that's a great reminder. Thank you so much. Jordan, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think like Grace said, like, and what I said before is like things that are going to affect us in the future. So like the rent stabilization one, like I said before, and Grace mentioned like the climate change one. Like I would be really interested in that because my like schooling and like future job is kind of centered around that. So stuff like, and like Grace said also like gun reform and all that different stuff, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not great at the terminology, but I would say things that I guess people my age are mostly concerned about are like our future, the well-being of like, you know, like the planet, how we're going to live, and money. Like most people my age don't have a lot of money. So any ways that they can just like be able to like have a little bit more money to live. So like that with the rent and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Thank you. Paul, did you want to respond to that?
I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to tell young people what they should vote about. So I'll take a hard pass on that. I will echo what Grace said, though. There's a lot of evidence that young people, we're only talking about turnout in tonight's webinar, and that's one form of political participation more broadly. And what Grace says is absolutely correct with respect to the research. Young people get involved in their communities in ways that turnout data do not and cannot pick up on.
Thank you. Yeah, I know we talk about that with Grace as co-chair of the Youth Vote Committee for League of Women Voters St. Paul, as many of the people we work with are not voter age yet and cannot vote. And there's other eligibility factors. And we talk about voter education and civic engagement in many ways. So I think that's very evident with this voting age population too. Okay, I have one last question for all three of you. What can League members and volunteers do to help, to support? You've already kind of emphasized this, but if there's any last statements you wanted to share, I'd love to hear it. I love all the reminders you've been sharing about just the factors that play into why you may or may not be voting. So if there's anything else you wanted to share about what League members and volunteers can do to help support you in voting or your peers, please let us know. Who wants to go first? Jordan.
I guess I could go. I come up with one. I would say that like a lot of people my age probably don't know that an organization like you guys exists. So if there was a way to like advertise, like you guys could like in colleges be like if, around voting seasons or like around election times, like if you need information, like you guys said you have that voting guide, like just like this is where you can find it. And I think like because we're just like so busy, if it was just like in our face in the hallway somewhere on the street, like this is where you could go to get information, I think maybe it would be like, I don't know, just like if it's somewhere where we are and it's just like right there, it'd be like a little easier, because I personally didn't know you guys existed until I started dating my girlfriend. So that's what I would say.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Grace, did you want to share something?
Sure. I think like asking the young people in your life whether or not they plan to vote, what their voting plan is, those things are really helpful, or like helping them make a voting plan. But also just like not being scared to like talk to the young people in your life about what they're thinking about with politics, and like, you know, sharing, like, you know, opening up that discussion. I think sometimes it's like scary because it's personal and like, but young people are thinking about it and might want to talk about it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Paul, did you have some advice as well?
Yeah, I guess sort of thinking about this sort of strategically, operationally. For younger members of the League who have a friend or an acquaintance who doesn't vote, do what you can to sort of have that person vote in the next election, whether it's a midterm, off-year, or presidential election, and convince that person to persuade one of his or her friends to turn out as well, and then follow up in the next election. So let's just say hypothetically, Heidi, if you sort of persuaded Jordan, and Grace, or leaned on them, or sort of took them out for drinks or whatever, and sort of got them to vote once, and they got a friend, and then you followed up. These habits kind of build over time and become self-reinforcing. So try to kind of accelerate the process whereby 18 to 29-year-olds are not regular voters. Maybe they're going to become that in their 30s. If we can sort of start that process earlier, literally by having persuasive spokespersons or friends. I think, Heidi, you would have more credibility persuading someone 18 to 29 to vote than I would, than sort of this old blowhard. Okay, boomer, whatever. But if you have younger League members can cajole, persuade, bribe, whatever it is, one person to vote, and that person gets someone else to vote, build those habits kind of one or two folks at a time.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I do think that I convinced my sister to vote, and she's in that age range, so I'm working on it. Well, thank you all so much. It was so great to hear your stories and see the presentations, and thank you so much for answering all these great questions from our audience as well. We learned so much, and I'm so grateful for your time tonight. A thank you to the League of Women Voters St. Paul Program Committee for the work behind the scenes of this program. Also, thank you to the League of Women Voters Roseville area and the League of Women Voters White Bear Lake area. And we can't forget our other partners of Suburban Community Network, Community, and then SPNN as well. Thank you so much. And thank you to our attendees for joining us tonight and for all of your great questions. After the program, a survey will pop up. Please complete as it reflects whatever your feedback for future programs. We use that information. And then we hope to see you next month on November 30th for our program, which will showcase the Youth Vote Student Leader Project. So more youth, and we really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much, everyone.